All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'll just start
Sure.
admitting people as they come through. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeremy Gill. I am the Kansas Room Coordinator here at the Hayes Public Library. For those that probably are like, what the heck's a Kansas Room Coordinator? I oversee the Dorothy D. Richards Kansas Room, which is a local history and reference collection here right in the smack dab of Kansas. For those that are joining outside of Kansas, which there are plenty of people that are, I welcome you to our Zoom. I'm really happy to have Craig here. Hayes, Kansas is located, like I said, right here in the middle. We're about halfway between Denver, Colorado, and Kansas City on I-70. We're a small little college community here in the High Plains. So I was telling Craig beforehand, just a fantastic and world-class place to garden with our hot, dry summers and relentless wind and hailstorms and possible tornadoes and freezing cold winters. We have it all here, but we have a lot of very persevering gardeners. I didn't just set this up as a librarian. I'm also a active gardener. I have been since I was a little kid. I am also kind of representing Kansas State University with the Master Gardener program. I'm a part of that group here in Ellis County in the Cottonwood District. I am fascinated with gardening and also the history. So Craig and I really share a lot of similarities. I'm very happy that he decided to do this with me when I reached out. He's been nothing but gracious to help out and questions that I've had, and also being a part of this Zoom. For those that don't know Craig, you probably know him from his book, Epic Tomatoes, which I was telling him that you can find pretty much anywhere, any bookstore here. I was actually going to pull it from here for the library to show people, and it's actually checked out. So that's a good thing. But
It's on my shelf somewhere back there.
there you go. There you go. Craig's also, you might also know one of his varieties, Cherokee Purple, that he named in 1990. I did grow that when I first bought my house here in Hayes, and it's an absolutely delicious variety. It's one of my favorites, and I'm not just saying that because of Craig. I knew about the tomato before I knew about Craig. Um, yeah, so we're really happy to have him. He's been involved in Seed Savers Exchange, saving heirloom tomatoes. He's been a pioneer in straw bale gardening, the dwarf tomato project, and all different types of stuff. And so I will go ahead and turn it over to Craig, and he can talk a little bit more about himself, and we can jump into this. And so thank you once again, everyone, for being here tonight.
Great. And thanks, everybody. Thank you, Jeremy, for the invitation to do this. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We just had the most delightful 30-minute chat about everything under the sun. Probably could have gone on for hours. Just what you said about the little things I'm doing, I'm exhausted already. I'm glad I'm retired. But this is what I do now. I've left pharma behind. And you need to buckle in and join me on this ride that we're going to have here, because we're going to go to lots of places in the next hour or so. The first half of this talk is going to be focused on some stories, some histories, some varieties, and then you'll have about 5 minutes or so for bio breaker questions after the halfway point. Then we're going to come back and talk 30 minutes for how to make all that happen. So that's where the culture stuff will take you from seed to seed saving. This may go a little bit over an hour. I am here for the long haul. If people want to stick around and answer questions and ask questions that I'll answer, it's 9:30 and it's going to be 9:30 in Hendersonville with the hour-and-a-half point. I don't go to bed till midnight. Not that I want to keep me that long. All right, epic tomatoes from your garden. So as you're asking questions, try to push me a little bit. I'm going to be talking about a lot of general things that are true for all gardeners, but need to be tweaked depending on where you're gardening and what the weather is going to be like. And we'll get into some of that. So I didn't mention what the weather is like here because I wanted to show you this picture. And this is absolutely bizarre. This is our magnolia. And it started blooming a few days ago. I looked back on my Instagram pictures from the last 3 years, and this is 1 month ahead. I don't know if that's going to bode very well for all of the daffodils and forsythias, the lilacs are beginning to bloom, but it's been very weird here. We haven't had a flake of snow. The long-term forecast shows some possible frost in the next couple of weeks, so we're not done yet. This is a picture I took of my backyard today. This is my garden. So we moved into Hendersonville 3 years ago, almost a little over 4 now. This is a septic field. So what this garden will look like when I begin to get it set up is this, straw bales, and there will be some containers added. When things are really kicking, this is what the garden looks like. So it's really enjoyable to step out into the backyard where I get a lot of sun and just be able to work the straw bales and the containers. But I want to talk about all forms of gardening. In fact, I'll be talking more about traditional gardening and just touch briefly on containers and straw bales. But I have to admit, I've fallen in love with growing tomatoes and straw bales. All right, let's think about where we are in history as tomato lovers. When we first moved into Raleigh in 1992, we moved down from Pennsylvania and we thought, a lot of farms in North Carolina, I bet you we're going to go to the farmer's market and find tons of all kinds of tomatoes and lots of diversity. But actually in 1992, this is mostly what you found. And in fact, what I want to tell you now, the next few slides, is why we who grow tomatoes now are the most fortunate in history. I want to take you back to 1840. This is a Brett Company seed catalog. And above the word tomato are maybe 20 or 30 different squash. And below the word tomato are 20 or 30 different turnip. However, there is simply tomato. This is a testament to the fact that at this time in America, people thought tomatoes were poisonous. So it wasn't until the 1860s, 1870s that tomatoes started becoming a favored vegetable and improvement projects were being done. Now, let's go back to that farmer's market and look at a picture I took just before we moved out of Raleigh in 2019. So now growers were coming in, small farmers, CSAs, you can get whites and yellows, oranges and greens, pinks and hearts. The reason that we are so lucky now is because of the efforts of the Seed Savers Exchange. When it formed in 1975, it provided a mechanism for seed sharing, and it stopped the disappearance of non-hybrid varieties. That's a term we're going to get to in a minute. So between the preservation of all of these varieties that were being kept on small farms and communities all over the world where people could share these seeds, with the emergence of seed companies that wanted to feature heirlooms like Southern Exposure, Seeds Bloom, Victory Seeds, Baker Creek, we now can choose from 10,000, 12,000, and that number increases all the time because there are breeding projects going on to create more and more. So I want you to think of this talk on one level is an assistance to you to help you decide what are you going to grow in your garden. And part of the parameters of that decision are there colors that you like? Are there particular flavor characteristics that you like? Do you want a short plant or a tall plant? Do you want a large fruit or a small fruit? Do you want to be a seed saver and share seeds with your friends? Or do you have a lot of disease problems? Do you need to grow certain hybrids because they have a better chance of success? So let's start down the path of that by just talking about a few terms that it's really good to get clear. So, and these terms do not connote quality. There are great hybrids. There are great heirlooms. We'll talk about what the differences between open pollinated and heirloom is in a moment, but a hybrid is a variety that has been created in a greenhouse from parents that are kept secret, typically if it's a variety you're buying from a seed catalog, a handmade cross. So let's say, for example, Sun Gold, which a lot of people absolutely love, one of my very favorite tomatoes. Somewhere in Asia, in a greenhouse, a company knows that if they take the pollen from one variety and apply it to the flowers after the anthers removed of the pollen acceptor, the female, another variety, a fruit will form if the pollination works. And it is the seeds in that fruit that end up in the packet. So every Sun Gold seed in that packet is from a handmade cross. That's why they're a little more costly, because there is some labor involved in creating that. Now, a hybrid can never be an heirloom, because if you grow Sun Gold and save seeds, and you grow plants, you will get tomatoes, but you will get ones that resemble dad, some that resemble mom, and some that resemble all kinds of variations in between. An heirloom is genetically stable because it's been grown for a long time and it's been handed down generation to generation. And if you grow a Cherokee Purple, for example, which appears to arise from somewhere in the late 1800s, well, I'll talk about that a little more in a moment. Unless the bees have visited the flower that you're saving that tomato from, you'll get Cherokee Purple. Open pollinated is in a way the opposite of hybrid. And it is in a way a synonym of heirloom, and that open pollinated are genetically stable. But there's lots of open pollinated tomatoes. Some of them have been created very recently, such as the Dwarf Tomato Project varieties. We can't really call them heirlooms yet because they've only been around 5 or 10 years. Whereas I think the word heirloom should be reserved for those open pollinated varieties that are genetically stable, that have stories, that have 60, 70, 80 years and more of history behind them. So that's one decision of you trolling through the seed catalogs. Do you want to tell stories with your garden? Do you want to show someone a plant and you know the story of that variety and you can tell them the story? That's a great way to create new gardeners. Let's talk a moment about an heirloom that has become quite widely known. And the story of Cherokee Purple starts with this letter. So we were gardening, we were living in Pennsylvania at the time. This letter arrived. A man who lived in Sevierville, Tennessee, named J.D. Green, knew me as someone who liked to collect tomato varieties. So all he said is, here's a purple tomato that is over 100 years old and originated with the Cherokee Indians. Not much to go on. So I grew it in my garden that year, hoping that the color was unique, and it was. This is before the black tomato craze. We had not seen tomatoes of that color very often. In fact, the only one really known at the time was one called Purple Calabash. It tasted delicious. So one of the things that sets gardeners apart is that when we have something great, we don't hoard it. We want to share it with as many people as possible. So I gave it the name based on the history shared with me by Mr. Green of Cherokee Purple, and I wanted to get it into a seed catalog. So I contacted my friend Jeff McCormick, who owned Southern Exposure Seed Exchange Virginia at the time, said, I've got a tomato for you. See what you think. So I sent him the seeds and he called me the next year and he said, I love the flavor. I love the story. It looks like a bad leg bruise. I don't think it's going to catch on. I really don't think people are going to want to grow that tomato because it's so ugly. But I'll tell you what, we'll list it in my 1993 catalog with a caveat, only for the adventurous. And look where we've gotten. Since this letter, I did manage to talk to Mr. Green a few times through the years. He has since passed on, but it turns out he got the tomato from a woman named Jean Greenlee, who lived in Rutledge, Tennessee. She got it from her grandfather, and it was her grandfather who received it from the Cherokee Nation in the late 1800s. So that's what we know about Cherokee Purple, and that is a very typical heirloom. So now let's look at a few open pollinated varieties that are not yet heirlooms. And this is also a testament to the intrepid spirit of gardeners that sometimes delight in finding that what they don't expect. It's like when you go to a nursery and get a 6-pack of marigolds, but you know that one of those plants is not a marigold. Do you toss it or do you grow it? I'd be willing to bet most people grow it just to see what it was. So I had about maybe 8 Cherokee Purple in my plants in my garden in Raleigh in 1995. And then one of the tomatoes, after they ripened, took on this dark brick red, almost mahogany color. And I thought, oh, must be a cross. So I saved seeds from it, and I grew out 8 or 10 plants the next year, and they were all chocolate colored. So my premise is that somehow I was lucky enough to plant a seed in which the skin color had mutated from clear to yellow, and Cherokee chocolate was born. Some years after that, I was growing out a whole slew of Cherokee chocolate, and one plant produced tomatoes that never appeared to ripen. They were just forming, beautiful, green, and then rotting and falling on the ground. So I went and grabbed one before it rotted, cut it open, green flesh, spectacular flavor, saved seeds, grew a whole bunch of plants the next year. They were all green. So this looks like it experienced a flesh color mutation from crimson to green, keeping the yellow skin. Cherokee green was born. These are all stable. They're all open pollinated. Many companies sell Cherokee chocolate. Johnny Selected Seeds. Rob Johnson contacted me and said, we tried this great green tomato that you are responsible for, Cherokee Green, and then they had in their catalog, not heirlooms yet, simply open pollinated. But I like to think of these as tomorrow's heirlooms, because if somebody in 50 years is still growing Cherokee chocolate and Cherokee Green, we can call them heirlooms. Now, this is a project that really is very near and dear to my heart. In fact, it's occupied a lot of my last 18 years. It's the dwarf tomato breeding project. And how this came about was when we were selling seedlings from our driveway in Raleigh. One of my most frequently asked questions was, what have you got that I can grow easily in a pot? I don't have to climb a ladder to pick. It has interesting, delicious tomatoes on it. I can grow it in a 5-gallon pot on my driveway, on my deck. The answer in 2004, before we started this project, was really not a whole lot, because you've got the determinate varieties like Taxi and Roma. They don't taste that great. You did have a few dwarf varieties, and I'll talk about what that is in a moment. That is a distinct genetic variety of dwarf tomato, but it was Dwarf Champion, a little 3-ounce pink. It was Lime Green Salad, a nice tomato, green when ripe, but 3 to 4 ounces. So I met on Garden Web a friend, Patrina, who lived in Australia, who liked to do crosses. And I had a seed catalog that showed that in 1915, the Isbell Company crossed a big pink tomato named Ponderosa with that Dwarf Champion I described. And then they created a hybrid and selected and created New Big Dwarf, which was a 3 to 4 foot tall plant with large tomatoes on it. And I said to Patrina, now that we've got all these colorful heirlooms to use as crossing partners, let's go crazy on this. So she made the hybrids. I was the project manager for the North American hemisphere, the North Hemisphere, she for the South Hemisphere. We could bounce seeds back and forth. That way we got 2 growing seasons in each calendar year. And I'll cut to the chase on this. We have employed the talents of over 1,000 amateurs and volunteers. The pay stinks, it's 0. But we've now put more than 150 dwarf tomatoes in seed catalogs. And our chief partner in this has been Victory Seeds. And they still, even though the company has been sold, Mike, the former owner, is in direct collaboration with Dave, the new owner in Texas, and essentially nothing will change. And I will continue to collaborate with Dave, and they will continue to introduce new varieties. This is what a dwarf tomato looks like. And I think of it as indeterminate in nature, in that it fruits gradually throughout the season. And because you never have the amount of foliage to blossoms and fruit totally out of whack, it is capable of developing the most intense, wonderful flavors. So if a Cherokee Purple in your garden is 8 feet tall by August, the corresponding dwarf will be only 4 feet tall. They don't need to be pruned. They have this very thick central stem, so they look different as soon as they pop out of the ground. The foliage, that dwarfing gene that creates the short height and the thick central stem, also crinkles up the foliage and turns it a dark blue-green. They're gorgeous plants, and these are 3 of them, including what at the time was very rare potato leaf dwarf in the front right. We have since created quite a few of them. Here's just a little bit of a look at some of our favorites. Dwarf Sweet Sue, which I named for my wife, is a 6 to 8 ounce bright yellow. As the name suggests, it's on the sweet side. One of our recent releases is a beautiful heart-shaped scarlet red with gold stripes, speckled heart. That one in the lower left looks like you took a Cherokee Purple and painted tie-dye stripes on it. That's Fred's tie-dye. And we even invented a color, or didn't invent it, but we saw it for the first time. And Uluru Ochre in the lower right is what happens when that Cherokee Purple, Cherokee Chocolate dusky characteristic occurs in an orange tomato. These are all really delicious. So now I want to continue on our first half travelogue with looking at the correlation between color and flavor. And just as I pause on this slide, tomato colors cause a lot of confusion. The color of a tomato is the visual effect of the flesh color with the skin color over the top of it. So Let's say in the upper right, you've got a Brandywine there, pink tomato. In the lower center, you've got a scarlet or a red tomato, red Brandywine. If you were to cut these two open, they would look identical inside. The difference is Brandywine has clear skin, red Brandywine has yellow skin. Lower left, Cherokee purple has clear skin, lower right, Cherokee chocolate has yellow skin. So let's think about this fun topic. Is there a correlation between color and flavor? And in my 40 years of gardening, I've grown maybe around 4,000 different varieties now. And I can confirm to you that each tomato variety is just like all of us. They're distinct. So, and to illustrate that, let's say that you favor a sweet tomato. Here are some options for you. These are just some of the options. Heart-shaped, pink Anna Russian, ivory-colored white queen, orange juice-colored Kellogg's breakfast. And I'm going, that was the up, left to right. Lower, the perfect round Eva purple ball, very sweet. Perhaps the sweetest tomato I've eaten are that class of tomatoes that are large and yellow with red streaks, and there are at least 80 of them. To me, they all taste pretty much the same, except for Lucky Cross, and I'll talk about that later. This one could be pineapple, could be Mammoth German Gold. I note this is Ruby Gold. They have the texture of and the appearance of on the inside and the flavor of a peach. So there are those who like a fruity, mild, sweet tomato, that is for them. And German Johnson, which interestingly is the only authentic North Carolina heirloom in the lower right, very, very sweet tomato. This is my category. These are the tomatoes that you dream about them over the winter because you know when you take a bite out of them, the flavor is going to linger in your mouth for minutes afterwards. They're the ones that you're tempted to fill your whole garden with, but you know that you have other varieties to grow for seed saving. And sometimes you just need to grow something contrasting it so then you can go back and realize how good these really were. These are the flavors of great intensity. Upper left, Lillian's Yellow Heirloom. The green one on the top is Dwarf Barrel Beauty, which is out of our dwarf tomato breeding project. Who'd have thought a tomato that stays green when it's ripe would have this intense tomato flavor. Nepal in the lower left is actually the tomato that turned me from a hybrid grower to an heirloom grower when I first grew that in 1987. And I still grow it. I grew it 2 years ago and loved it just as much as I did then. Rosella Purple is the tomato in the lower center. That's another one of our dwarfs that people really, really like. Think of it as essentially a dwarf growing version of Cherokee Purple, and that's Cherokee Chocolate on the right. So something really interesting when I was selling plants is I had many requests for a quote. I want a tomato that tastes like when I was young and it was so acidic it made my tongue curl. And it just turns out that for whatever reason, the vast majority of heirlooms do seem to be on the sweeter or intense side, and it is harder to find the tomatoes where you can really identify that true acidic tartness. But there's a selection for you. Tiger Tom in the upper left, Green Zebra in the center. One of my favorites, a bright yellow tomato from Russia called a Zoichka in the upper right. An ivory white one from our dwarf project, Dwarf Mr. Snow. We brought this to our Tomato Palooza tasting in Raleigh when we were doing it some years ago. And of the 250 varieties, Mr. Snow was the favorite variety. It was also the one that tasted the most tart. Dwarf Blazing Beauty, another one of our dwarfs in the center. And the one in the lower right, Acres, West Virginia, is just you're going to go to the farm stand with your parents or grandparents on a Sunday afternoon. You get a big bag of big red beefsteak tomatoes, bring them home and have your cookout. That's what that tomato is like. So I'm going to pause here and just say to remind you, we're not doing questions yet, but I'm going to remind you, think of in terms of making those choices in that catalog. I'm trying to give you hints and tips for what to choose. And the fact that a lot of you are gardening in Kansas, we'll talk about varietal specification to location when we get into our second part. I just wanted to share some of the highlights of my last 3 years when I gardened here in Hendersonville, this being a new garden spot for us and me learning an awful lot. One of the first really fun experiments I did, I love pink potato leaf tomatoes, but they're all subtly different. So I wanted to take 3 of my favorites and grow them side by side and just look at the tomatoes to see if I could tell by looking at the fruit if there are subtle characteristic differences, and there are. And the lower left is Polish, slightly ribbed shoulders. And the center rear is stump of the world, which is shaped more angular. They call that boat shaped. And then on the right lower is Brandywine. And a lot of people are not growing the correct Brandywine because they think of it as a big, ugly, lumpy, ribbed tomato. But this is the authentic strain that goes right to Ben Quisenberry. And it is actually a very smooth shouldered tomato. Now you cut any one of these open and you get what I like to call the ideal tomato interior for tomato lovers, meaning not the big white central core with all of the seeds around the edge that flops out. You end up with like an onion ring to put in your sandwich. It's every bite has tomato in it, very small seed cells, lots of flesh throughout. And it seems like most of the really high quality beefsteak heirloom types have this interior, but it doesn't mean they all taste great because I've tasted a few that are not particularly good. Again, it's in the genes. Lucky Cross looks like one of those typical yellow-red heirlooms, but this was created in my garden by bees crossing pollen from a neighboring variety onto Brandywine. And then I worked with this for 8 years to get a potato leaf, bright yellow tomato with red swirls that has much of the flavor of Brandywine. And this and its smaller fruited sister Lucky Cross are really the only two indeterminate bicolors that I really enjoy eating. And another great surprise is that one of my top 5 tomatoes for flavor doesn't even change colors barely when it's ripe. I received this from Reinhard Kraft, a German tomato enthusiast. I looked at his website and I saw in his pictures he had a green flesh tomato on potato leaf foliage. So he sent me some seed. It has been one of my favorites ever since. And I sent this to lots of seed companies and they're selling it now. The only way you can really tell it's ripe is if you look in the bottom and there's a very, very pale pink blush, but it's worth growing. And then a few people continue to send me family heirlooms. And the one on the left at this point is called Earl. It will be renamed when it's released by Victory, hopefully next year. But it's another one of these big pink beefsteaks. It was one of the absolute best tomatoes I've eaten in my life. And then the one in the upper right is a tomato that grew great in Pennsylvania, hated growing in Raleigh. But I decided to give it a chance in Hendersonville, North Carolina here, and it just astounded. That picture on the right is a slice of a 2.5-pound scarlet red heart. And I'm working to get Victor to introduce it because some cross seed started becoming sold by the Seed Savers Exchange years ago, and almost all of the commercial sources now are growing the wrong tomato. So I really want Victor to get this out there. Last thing I'm going to talk to you about before the break is kind of a passion that I had since I love heirlooms and I love to eat tomatoes. I always wondered what happens if I take 2 of my favorite tomatoes and cross them and create a hybrid. Will the hybrid be better than each of the parent? Will it be as good? So I took Cherokee Purple on the left and I made the cross with Lillian's Yellow Heirloom. Those are 2 of my top 3 tomatoes. The hybrid in the middle was the best tomato in my garden. And we're now playing around with saved seeds to see what kind of combinations we get. Here's an example of a few other crosses we did and some selections with Polish and Blues Bling, which is a variegated tomato. This is one of the selections from Lillian's Yellow and Cherokee Purple on the top. It's this weird rosy color, and that's Little Lucky Times Blue Bling on the lower right. They're all delicious. They're all really cool looking, but they're only at the F3 generation. So if anybody on this call wants to help me treasure hunt some of these, all you need to do is email me and we'll see what my seed supply is, but I think I can still sneak you some seeds. So covered a lot of ground, got a lot of ground left to cover, but I use this really strange slide. This is still life with Marlin and Lucky Cross to indicate kind of the halfway point, 5 minutes for a bio break. And Jeremy, if there's a few questions from the chat that you want to pop in that are focused on kind of the variety, story, history, flavor thing, we can cover some of those.
Sure. Great job so far. So if anyone has questions, just drop them in the chat really quick if they're our kind of halfway point here. Someone said, what is the correct strain of Brandywine?
Brandywine, we could talk for a half hour on. So if you see just the word Brandywine, it should be the variety that was given from the Sudduth family to an Ohio seedsman named Ben Quisenberry. And then it made its way into the Seed Savers collection, and it became very popular. Independent of that is a variety called red Brandywine that seems to have originated perhaps with the Johnson and Stokes Seed Company up in Pennsylvania in 1890, that has regular leaf foliage and yellow skin over pink flesh, so it looks scarlet, and the size is not nearly so great. Then there is a yellow Brandywine, which I got from a woman named Barbara Lund in Ohio. Now, if you look at old seed catalogs, they sold in the 1880s a potato leaf pink variety called Mikado and a potato leaf golden yellow variety called Shah. We will never know for sure, but it could be that Brandywine and yellow Brandywine are regrowings and renamings way back over 100 years to Mikado and Shah. This is why having inexpensive DNA testing would be so much fun. But the other issue is we don't have old samples of those seeds from the 1890s around to DNA test. So as you know, Jeremy's a historian, sometimes it's hard, and I love genealogy as well. And sometimes you just hit some dead ends and you just got to start, you got to start taking some best guesses, but then qualify the inferences you've made. A lot of seed companies don't want to do that. And they want to create, we just found this and we just found that. They're extinct, but they're trying to sell products. So you can always count on me to try to seek for the truth, even if it's a little unpopular with people who are trying to make money off this. So there you go.
All right. I don't see too many other questions. I guess I'll pop in just really quick so maybe people have an understanding of where you get these seeds. I mean, I know you said it's through the Dwarf Project, and you talked about Victory Seeds. Is that where you mostly go to?
So I've built my collection. I think I have over, I don't know, 5, 6, 7,000 varieties, and some of them are getting too old to germinate. But I was a Seed Saver member right from 1986, and I amassed a lot of my collection from that. And that's still, you know, the organization has gone through a lot of evolution and changes over the years, but we would not be the gardeners we are today with the variety we have without them. So I think they're absolutely worth supporting. And their yearbook is like a phone book of seeds of everything. You can get 10,000 different tomatoes. There are so many seed companies. What I like to do is suggest that people go to a website called the Garden Watchdog, because what that is, it collects reviews from people who are using these seed companies. And there are so many, and there are so many new ones popping up all the time, that it's hard for me to recommend too strongly, because people will say, well, you didn't mention this one. Does that mean they're not good? Not at all. I would say do your research. Some companies really do focus on heirlooms and open pollinateds, like you know, Victory, Southern Exposure, Baker Creek. Some are very well balanced, like Johnny's. Some are more towards really nicely priced budget packets, like Pine Tree. I didn't put slides in, but the other thing I'll say here is beware, because people have been now seed saving actively since the mid 80s, and there is stuff out there that is not what you think it is. So just if I go to a Lowe's or a Home Depot and look through the seed rack, and they'll have a picture of Cherokee Purple, just by looking at the interior of that tomato, I can tell that they're not selling the real thing anymore. So the great thing about seed saving is lots of people are getting involved. The inevitable risk is that you're going to get some cross-pollination that are going to change things. What I try to do for everything I've received is follow its genealogy and always go back as close as I can to the source seed to grow it out, so that I can help remedy it. If an example of a variety that seems to be lost is Abraham Lincoln, a historic variety from 1923 that, according to the catalogs, had bronzy colored foliage and large 1-pound tomatoes on a very tall plant. And the seed company that was shepherding that along seemed to have lost the seed stock in the 60s, and nobody seems to have the real thing anymore. So seeds are living things. They can go extinct. So as you sing, Jeremy, short questions often get long answers from me, but it's so much fun.
Yeah, well, and you know, just with what you're saying with names can change too, because you can still buy what people pass off as Abraham Lincoln. That is still a variety that you can get, and there's kind of like varying degrees on what people even call that. So
Well, and to take that one step further, let's say I made a comment, there's like 10,000 different varieties listed in the Seed Savers catalog. Does that represent 2,000 actually distinct tomatoes with lots of synonyms and misspellings and renaming? So clearly through the years, you know, somebody hands you a tomato in the 1890s that's saying, here's Grandpa Joe's tomato. The next generation comes along. What is that tomato? Ah, Uncle Willie loves that tomato. So now all of a sudden it's got two names, because invariably people have it. They have some in the previous name, some in the new name. Replicate that over the decades, and there's no doubt that we have many of the same variety that have lots of different names now. And again, it would take expensive DNA testing to unravel that. So as gardeners, do we have to worry about that? No, my plea is be accurate. If you've got a variety and you want to save seeds, you want to put it into a seed library or share it, make sure you're not saving seeds from a hybrid, because whoever gets that seed, who knows what they're going to get. Make sure the spelling is correct. Try to be as accurate as you can. And let's not even get into the possibility of crossing yet. Maybe we can touch upon that when we get into seed saving at the end.
Yeah, great.
Cool.
How about we just shoot for one more, just brief one here? Are all the dwarf tomatoes around 4 feet?
The reason I don't like to be specific on it, it's the same reason as days to maturity to me are meaningless, because the overriding mitigating factors on things like height and maturity dates are your weather, the hours of sun that I get. So if you were to put pretty much all of the dwarf tomatoes with 8 to 10 hours of direct sun, they'd probably be around 3 or 4 feet tall. If it's 4 to 6 hours of sun, then they would start compensating for stretching for that sun, and they could end up taller. There are a couple that tend to grow a little bit taller. There's a family called Teensy that we used a tomato called Mexico Midget to breed. And Mexico Midget is like, it could be 30 feet in your yard. So that dwarf can reach 5 or 6 feet by the end of the growing season. But think of that as growing upwardly about half. And don't even worry about the determinate, indeterminate clarification with dwarfs. I call them dwarfs, and they all behave pretty much the same. Try to get that indeterminate, determinate name out of your head and think this is just a distinct third type of tomato that I can grow.
Fantastic. All right.
Ready to roll?
I'm ready to rock.
You're going to have more questions at the end, I guarantee. So how do we make all this happen? And I used to be on podcasts with a friend who sadly has since passed away, called Daryl Poulos. And she used to say, Craig, I like you on my show because you like to break rules. This is an example of maybe a sort of rule breaking that we'll get to in a moment. Let's start by taking out the familiar saying, size does matter. With tomatoes, definitely, because, and I touched upon it a little bit with the dwarf comment in terms of height. If you want to grow the big 2.5 pound mortgage lifter that's on the left, you really want to have 6 to 8 hours of direct sun, 8 hours if you can. Otherwise, you're going to have a skimpy yield, and that plant is just going to become a Jack and the Beanstalk plant with not much to show for it. I remember when I was selling plants in Raleigh, a customer came back and said, that mortgage lift you sold me just didn't do well for me. You know, I apologized. I said, I'll replace it. What happened? Well, I planted it and I know it only got an hour and a half of sun a day, but I ended up with a 12-foot tall plant with only 2 tomatoes. And I'm like, okay, so you need to give the larger fruited varieties sun. If you have 4 to 6 hours of sun a day, you can get away with tomatoes up to 6 ounces, 8 ounces, 6 hours of sun, up to 12 ounces, maybe a pound. Just think in terms of the link between hours of sun and the size of the fruit that you want to grow. The bigger the tomato, the more sun it needs to be happy. However, the good news is, if you want to put a container on the back of your deck that only gets a few hours of sun a day, put a cherry tomato in. You won't get the best yield in the world, but you'll have fresh tomatoes. The other thing in talking about where you're gardening in Kansas is the effect of heat and humidity. So something that I learned to live with in Raleigh, and some data that I collected. In 1992, when we moved into Raleigh, we had 5 days of temperatures 90 or above. When we moved out in 2019, that summer we had 70 days, 90 or above. And I saw this in action in the decreased yields of my large fruited tomatoes. So what happens in that previous slide, I showed you that big monstrous tomato. Those are going to be the fussiest in terms of fruit set under consistent high heat conditions. So you can set up some kind of a screening to create a lower temperature microclimate around the plant. Another good thing to do is to buy a veggie bee or a vibrating tool that's what we use for making tomato crosses to get pollen out of the flowers, or you can just flick the blossoms. If you're really in dire straits with heat, you're 100 or above, you can actually get to the point of pollen die-off. So extreme heat will always affect the yield of your larger fruited tomatoes, and in extreme heat, even all of your tomatoes. The key is to keep your tomatoes healthy and happy and hydrated and alive, because eventually you will have ebbs and flows of those super hot stretches. That's when you want the blossoms to open and the fruit to set. So using timing, getting things out as early as you can, so you capture some of that pre-90 or 100 temperature, and then keep the plants happy, or use succession planting so that later in the year when things are easing off, you have plants that are actively blooming. Let's a few more terms to help you decide as you're looking through the seed catalogs. 95% of tomatoes are indeterminate. That is the natural state of tomatoes as they originated on the coasts of South America and made their way from Central America over to Europe. They grow like trees. In fact, in climates where it doesn't freeze, they will just keep growing and growing. Usually a disease will kill them first, or the gardener just gets sick of growing them and pulls it out and wants to start from scratch. But that picture on the left is me in my Raleigh garden standing next to Cherokee Purple in July. We still had August and September to go. So this is what indeterminate tomatoes do. You need a pruning strategy. You need a staking strategy, and we'll cover that later. Determinate tomatoes are like nice, well-behaved children. Determinants form a plant that's about 3 or 4 feet tall, and then all of a sudden it bursts into blooms like a forsythia, sets a lot of tomatoes. They ripen almost all at once over a couple of weeks, and then you can toss the plant. It's done what it needs to do. The ratio of flowers and fruit to foliage is so far out of whack that you will never get the absolute best flavored tomato out of a determinate variety. Nobody I know has ever run into a grocery store to grab a Roma, take a bite, and say that is the best tomato I've ever eaten. It just doesn't happen. Dwarfs on the right side lower combine the balanced fruiting and flowering and fruiting of indeterminates, the slow upward growth. I actually measured indeterminates in the middle of summer grow 2 to 3 inches upward. Dwarf varieties grow a ½ inch to 1 inch upward. So they do grow upward at about half the rate. But both determinants and dwarfs are very happy in the useless metal cone-shaped tomato cage, 4 feet tall. The ones that indeterminates climb through the top within a few weeks. Your dwarf or determinate will be very happy there. So when you're looking at your space, when you're planning your ability to support plants, both determinants and dwarfs will do just fine in 5-gallon containers. The more root space, the better, but they'll be fine. The calendar is really, really important for successful gardening. And what I always like to use is the estimated last frost date in terms of that's when I'm going to put my plants out. Then I work backwards 2 months, and that's when I start my seed. And there is not a lot of specificity in gardening, so there is wiggle room in this. If 1 week either side here and there is fine, but this is easy to remember. So this is very timely because tomorrow we're in early March, and I'll be putting my tomatoes into the straw bales and containers in early May. So I'm going to do the majority of my tomato seed planting over the next 2 or 3 days. It takes about a month to get them to the stage where you're going to separate them out and transplant. Now, we'll talk about separating them out, what that means in a minute. And then it takes about a month for that plant to get into a point where it's ready to go. Now, things like greenhouses or temperatures are going to affect this timing. How many seeds you have planted into a cell will affect this timing. Some things about seed starting that I think are really key. And this is where I break the rules. it is really okay to plant lots of seeds in a cell. And I use a 50 cell plug flat. I'm not sure if you can see this behind me. On that middle shelf is my plug flat of older tomato seedlings. So these are taking quite a while to germinate. I have actually gone to not only doing this with tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant, but also lettuce and greens and beets and flowers and herbs. This methodology of dense planting was born out of necessity because we wanted to sell thousands of tomato seedlings in Raleigh, and I had no greenhouse, and I needed to make use of a table up in my office. So this gives you the chance to grow 2,000 seedlings roughly, depending on how many seeds you want to force into a cell, and a 1x2 foot footprint. Very, very critical success factors for good tomato germination luck is a sterile, soilless planting mix. And there are lots of them on the market. There are pro mixes. I really like SunGrow's Metro Mix. There's Sunshine Mix. What you don't want to do is start seeds and just go out into the garden and grab some soil and bring it in, because the worst thing that happens with tomatoes once they germinate is if they get damping off disease. And that's a fungus that attacks around where the stem meets the soil, and they just fall over. I have never lost a tomato seedling to damping off disease once I've started going to a good quality sterile soilless mix. So I fill the containers and then I water them because I want the seeds to sit on moistened medium to get them off to a start. And then I just lightly sprinkle the medium on top till I can't see the seeds anymore. So they're about 1/32 of an inch deep. And then I mist them. Then I just loosely lay saran wrap over them. Now, if you have those plastic domes, that's fine as well. But because they're so shallowly planted, you don't want them to start the germination process and then all of a sudden that surface dries out. With fresh seed, and then they are on a constant temperature, very inexpensive heat mat. Sun or light is not necessary for tomato or eggplant or pepper seed germination, but warmth helps. So I find the way I plant them, I get really good germination starting in 3 days. Typically, they're all up by 4 or 5 days, and that's seed up to, say, 8 years old. When you get into 8 to 10-year-old seed, it starts slowing down a little bit. 15 years seems to be the drop-off point of tomato seed viability. After that, it kind of goes off the cliff. So once the majority of your seedlings pop, you remove the plastic, you turn off the heat mat, because if you have bottom heat and there's nothing to hold in the moisture, then you're going to dry out very, very quickly. I turn it 180 every day because you're going to see phototropism. And at this point, you've got some decisions to make. Just before you hit the true leaf stage, or once you have tiny true leaves, or once you start seeing significant bending, if you don't have good light coming in at them, you're going to want to get a light source on them so they don't just start growing and flopping all over the place. And I still haven't graduated to LEDs yet because I've got all of these inexpensive fluorescents hanging around. And they're great. They run really cool, and I can keep the light source very low to the plants. When you start switching to more expensive LED setups, you have to really be careful of the distance between your plant tips and the light, because you can get them burned easily. Now, I used to do this a lot in Raleigh because winter would hang on, and I had them in my garage. Here in Hendersonville, we're starting to get some really mild days quite early on. So I'm skipping the light stage totally and just going to, even when they're very young seedlings, getting a day where I've got filtered sun coming through the pine needles and it's maybe 45 or 50 out, and it's calm, it's not raining. I'll give them an hour or two, making sure they're very well watered. Then I'll bring them in. Next day, they get 2 or 3 hours. Within a week, they're living outside all day, even in the full sun. And the only time they'll come in is if it looks like there's a frost forecasted. Tomato seedlings, pepper seedlings can take temperatures down to 33, 34 degrees without any harm. Eggplants can as well, but when they get cold, they look awful. They start flopping over, then you get them into the warmth and they perk up again, but they can really scare you. So let's say now your plants are ready to go. They're hardened off. They've been in the sun or they've been under lights and they're starting to get to the point where they're showing true leaves. You've used that nice fluffy soil mix. So now you just pop up the little plug and you press with your thumbs. The plants break apart. Yeah, you'll lose a few seeds, but any part of the tomato stem under the surface will root. And I actually do deep planting with everything: lettuce, greens, peppers, eggplant. I like to buy the 18 strips of very light plastic that are perforated together and they fit in a nice web tray. But I fill with the same mix that I seed in, but I don't water it before I transplant, because if you were to water it, it would get a very stiff surface tension to it. And by poking the seedlings in, you would be more likely to break the stem. But it eases in really nice. You just cover the stem and then you water it very well. If you were to put the plants right out into the sun after this, most of them would fry and die, because the plants now have to learn to take up water through those root systems that have been disturbed. I just leave them in my garage for 2-3 days. I've left them as long as a week. The roots are doing the work. The tops are just going to sit there until it gets warm anyway. But within a month, you have seedlings to sell, seedlings to plant, seedlings to give away. So now let's start looking at different techniques and troubleshooting and things to watch for. Now, when we lived in Raleigh, before these trees grew tall, I hand dug a garden, and that's where I used to do my traditional in-ground gardening. And these are some of the things that I would always watch out for. If you have a heavy clay or rock substructure and it rains and these holes fill up like this, like they did in my yard, and the next day you still got water there, you've got a problem, because tomatoes hate wet feet. So you either have to mound up a center like a hill and put the tomatoes into the top of the hill. So if you get excess rain, the water drains off. And then by the time that tomato matures, the roots can be able to handle all that water. Or you just get in there and break up that hard pan underneath and make sure that it perks. Now, a tomato that is drowning will look like it needs water, and it can fool you. But they just hate wet feet. If those roots are sitting in a bowl of water, the plant will wilt, and over time it will die. Mulching is just such an important aspect of successful tomato growing, because much of what goes after tomatoes, and believe me, tomatoes are like roses. Every critter, disease, you name it, goes after it. And a lot of those agents are going to live in the soil, particularly if you've been growing tomatoes in one spot for quite a few years. So with tomatoes, it's build the quality in from the front and deal with the problems as they arise, but don't start off by injecting issues into your plant right from the start. So I like to use untreated grass clippings. Shredded leaves are okay. Shredded bark is okay. It has to breathe and it has to let water through. But really the key is you're preventing a barrier from the soil splashing onto the lower leaves, which means spores will get on those leaves and you'll start getting the onset of diseases. I like to water at the base of the plant. I'm showing here in containers, but this is what I did in my garden as well. If you water tomatoes from above with a sprinkler, you're wasting water, because a lot of it's going to evaporate before it even gets to the plant. Most of that water is not going to get down to the roots where it's needed, but you're wetting the foliage, which creates countless magnets for floating disease spores to land on. So keep the foliage dry. Anybody who lives in an area like we did in Raleigh, where you get humid thunderstorms in the evening and that foliage stays wet all night, invariably the next day you can see disease start to come on. A little bit about containers. This is a way to really expand what you can grow, and you can grow anything and everything in a container equally well to growing it in the ground. I like to go with the reusable plastic grow bags on the left that are really inexpensive. I get them from Peaceful Valley in California. Their website is groworganic.com. They have holes punched into the bottom. Some of the grow bags I have are over 10 years old now, so I'm not buying these and then dumping plastic into recycling. I'm just using them and using them. That fake terracotta in the rear right, I've had that one for 30 years. So they work just great. The key is a drainage hole in the bottom. When I had to move from my side garden in Raleigh, I turned my driveway into a garden. And this is where I learned the ins and outs of successful container gardening. I would pick a ton of produce from this driveway, excuse me, And yes, my neighbors thought I was insane. The homeowners association thought this was pretty sketchy until I gave them tomatoes and eggplants and peppers. I just mentioned a little bit about building quality into your tomatoes from the start. So what you put in those containers is very important. Lots of options, but I really like a soilless mix unmitted with some compost. And whether this is the big yellow cube, soil cubed, which we can get here in the East, it's just composted leaves and grass clippings. I typically will use a bagged commercial mix. You know, for years I used Miracle Grow potting mix, but then it just got really expensive and the bags got smaller. So now I'm using Stay Green, which we can get at Home Depot or Lowe's in 2.8 cubic foot bags. It's about $11 or $12. And I'll use a 3-to-1 ratio roughly of that mix to bagged cow manure. But you can just play with this any way you want. You can make your own soilless mix from, sterilized loam or shredded wood, perlite, vermiculite, some peat moss. I know there's a lot of avoidance of peat mixtures, so somebody just sent me a sample of pit moss to try out. So this is an evolving thing. What to start your seeds in and then what to use in your containers is an area for lots of personal exploration so that it fits in with your own personal gardening philosophy. Straw bale gardening. Oh, one thing I wanted to say with containers before I left is with respect to watering. When you plant in the ground, the water goes in and it can pool where the roots can reach it. When you plant in a container or a straw bale, the roots can only get to the water that is in near it, either in the straw bale or in the container. So I am watering more frequently. And in fact, in containers or in straw bales, when you're really getting into the summer heat, I'm watering daily. And when the plants start getting really big, I'm feeding weekly. And I'm not fancy about what I feed. I just use a general all-purpose water soluble. And each plant, I dissolve it up a tablespoon per gallon, and each plant gets about 1.5 cups per week. And it works great. I tend to read my plants. I'm with my plants a lot. So when they're unhappy, I react to it. But when they're happy, there's nothing really to react to. Straw bale gardening is centered on turning a straw bale into a compost bin. And the way that's done is by treating it with high doses of nitrogen on alternating days for about a week, lots of watering, saturating them every day. And then after the nitrogen is done, you go with a balance, like a 10-10-10 granular, and then you water that in. And then 2 weeks from the time you start the initial preparation, you can plant your bale. Now it's flexible. I could buy bales tomorrow and treat them over that 2-week period and then not use them for another month or two. So if you find a good source or you find them on sale, get them, place them first, because once you start treating them, they're too heavy to move. And you can just have wonderful success with it. So at that 2 weeks, the straw will be soft. You just take cultivators or your hands and you dig a crevice, separate the straw. Pop your plant out of the pot with a root ball, fill it into the crevice. The only mix that you're adding is to fill in that crevice that you create. So each of these bales contains no more than 1 cup or 2 of potting mix. Everything else they make themselves. And the plants, the mushrooms take off first. You'll see some wheatgrass, but then the tomatoes just go completely berserk. The last 2 years, I've harvested 25 to 30 pounds per plant, and I have 2 plants per bale. And that's over very concentrated harvest because we have disease coming here quite quickly. So that's between early July and mid-August, an average of 25 or 30 pounds a plant. That makes for lots of canning. But this is what the bales look like when the tomatoes are caught on. They were about 1 foot tall. And I have a picture later of what happens if you don't do what I'm going to describe now. So if you want to focus on determinate and dwarf, don't pay attention to this section. But if you want to grow indeterminates, do. Because suckers freak almost all gardeners out at one point in their gardening career. But they're nothing to be scared of. You have to just understand that every indeterminate plant will produce a sucker every time the main stem, which is vertical, meets the leaf stem, which is out at 90 degrees, 45-degree angle, here comes the sucker. And the suckers will produce suckers. So this becomes a geometric nightmare very, very quickly. Now, if you're a cage, if you have very rich ground and you cage your plants, so you have 6-foot tall concrete reinforcing wire or something similar cages, you don't have to sucker your plant. You're going to have to heavily water it and feed it so it keeps up. But you can get 40, 60, 80 pounds of fruit off the plant. It will just be crazy. Suckers do not draw energy out of the plant. They make a plant complicated. So have a strategy. And what I do, because I'm a staker, is I will decide I'm going to let 2 or 3 suckers go this year and pull all of the other ones off, which means I will have a plant with 4 fruiting stems. If you pull all of your suckers off, let's say you get 10 pounds of fruit, let 1 sucker develop, your potential yield is now 20 pounds, etc. Another good thing about suckers, let them grow a little bit, stick them in a glass of water, and they will root very quickly, or put them in damp soil in the shade. You now have plants to use for succession planting. So if you know you may have a critter problem or disease problem or some really bad weather's coming, just clone your plants, get them coming along, and then if your main planting disappoints, or if you want to plant in batches, you'll have them coming along. And let's say your neighbor comes over and they love your sun gold, you can just create a sun gold for them by rooting a sucker. If you do not sucker your plants at all, you end up with a pickup sticks effect. And these plants are healthy, they're happy, they're producing like crazy. But anytime these plants are touching, it's like a highway for disease spread. You're creating shady areas, you're creating tunnels for critters to get into. If you do pay attention, like I did the year that Joe Lample and I created our tomato course, and I wanted to follow what I preached in Epic Tomatoes, then you end up with this, a vertical garden where everything is in pretty good shape. Now, it still went out of control eventually, but I had most of my yield in before that. And this is what I ended up with, was so many tomatoes. We canned 63 quarts, we gave away tons, and we had the terror of the harvest when you've got the fruit flies coming on, tomatoes are rotting, things aren't smelling good. So yeah, you got to give a lot away. A few things about the common diseases you may face. Most of the diseases that really nail us are fungal in nature. One called early blight, which creates blemishes on the leaves, which if you look at, almost look like they have concentric rings. And the other is called septoria leaf spot, which is very appropriately named. Now, in each of these cases, the spores are on the flip side of the leaves. So if you leave the blemished leaves on the plant, those spores will float around the rest of the garden. I do not spray anything in my garden. What I do is try to do disciplined damaged foliage removal. And where you find the damaged foliage the most is on the inside of the plant. The sun is a great disinfectant, but it can't reach sometimes the inside of the plant, and it can't reach the back of the plant. So that's where disease often starts and spreads from. The real sad diseases are the ones that work through the roots and kill your plants. And this is an example of what fusarium wilt does. This plant looked great, but it was well watered. And then one day I went out and it looked like it did on the left. I watered it, still looked like that. A few days later, the leaves started getting bright yellow. Fusarium is a fungus that's present in the soil that goes up into the roots, and it turns water transportation into the top of your plant. You may as well pull the plant. What's the important point to know is you know that you have the fusarium fungus in that area of your garden. So you have to rotate away from that for a few years. Or you can put fabric, landscape, cloth, or something on the top and plant, if that's a great area with great sun exposure, plant in containers or straw bales. Just don't let the roots get into the soil. I showed this picture because this plant should not have gotten fusarium. This was in a straw bale. And so my supposition, some tomato diseases can stick into the seed coat, even if you ferment the seed. So if you want to be guaranteed that you're not introducing diseases into your plants through the seeds, you do a hot water treatment, which is putting them in a little mesh bag and immersing them in water that's 122 degrees, use a sous vide in a bowl for 25 minutes. Then you plant your seeds and you've wiped out the bacterial, the viral, and the fungal infections that may be lurking there. Commercial seed, you don't have to do that. But home safe seed, if you're saving seed from a plant that's got issues, it might be a good thing to try. As far as pests, one of the ones that really kind of astounds people because of the size and the speed at which they get big are tomato hornworms or tobacco worms. If they look like they do in the large picture, get them off your plant. If they look like they do in the insert picture, that's great because a wasp has laid eggs that have pupated that worm. They will hatch and eat the worm from the inside out. So leave it. It will affect other worms. They're very camouflaged. If you can't find one, get a black light, go out into the garden at night and shine the light on your plants. Your neighbors will think you're totally off your gourd, but the hornworms light up bright green and you can get rid of the pests. Two things to mention here. We're rapidly approaching the end where we'll have more time for questions, but these are physiological issues. This is nothing wrong with the variety. It's nothing wrong with the seed. It's not a disease. It is the conditions in which the tomato is being grown, conditions being weather or how you're treating it. And so blossom end rot, which every gardener who's grown tomatoes has seen at some point in their lives, comes from stressed plants. And the stress prevents calcium from being absorbed and the lesion formed, and that's that. If you keep your plants well and evenly watered to the point where they're not wilting on a hot summer day, you'll probably almost completely eliminate it. Now, plants are going to be stressed at different points of their growing development. For example, the plant's growing, it's putting out foliage, it's putting out suckers, it's got flowers, it's got little green fruit. You get a hot day and at some point, the plant's not going to be able to keep the nutrients coming in to keep up with all of that. So you may get one or two early fruit with it. But if it's a consistent problem, just keep your plants well watered. The fruit on the right has cracking, which we don't like. However, there's a reason for it. It's because that fruit was left on the vine until it's fully ripe, and then a rainstorm happened or it was watered, and the skin could not enlarge at the rate that liquid was being taken up into the center of the plant. So the solution is pick your fruit when they're about half ripe or so. So the top half of the fruit will be green, the bottom half will be colored. Bring them in, put them on your shelf. Within 2 or 3 days, they will fully ripen just like this and taste just as good as if you left them on the vine. And the bonus is vine ripe tomatoes have a very, very short shelf life, but boy, can they attract critters. And so that's when you're most likely to get bites taken out. Usually when things like birds are pecking your tomatoes, they're thirsty, and nothing like a fully ripe tomato to get liquid. This is what happens if you can't keep up with it. During that year where I was just assaulted with tomatoes, I was leaving them on the vine, they were getting cracked. So it really does make a difference. 30 seconds on seed saving. Cut up your tomatoes, squeeze the gunk into a cup, put it somewhere where a really bad smell isn't going to bother people, but it will undergo a fermentation process that causes a mold layer to form that breaks down the gel. The gel on each seed protects the germination inhibitor that coats each seed. Once you ferment that gel away, you can get a couple little tomato plants. So after only about 2 or 3 days when you see that white surface, bring it in, fill it up with water, stir it, the good seeds sink, you decant off the smelly liquid on the top, put it in your compost bin, whatever. Do that a few times, you end up with all your good seeds at the bottom. Put them through a sieve. I put them on unglazed paper plates. It takes about a week to dry, and there's lots of different ways to store seeds. If you just store them, like you can see behind me, a host of seeds in coin envelopes, I'm getting 10, 12 years out of them. I don't have the room, but if I were to dry them down and refrigerate them, that longevity would be in the 20 year or more. If you were to freeze them, you're talking 25 to 50. So here we are. We lucky people that get to grow all of the colors of the rainbow in our tomatoes. What do we, the LeHoulliers, like to do? We like to slice them and do taste testings. And I drive my wife crazy by saying, let's start at noon and let's work around clockwise and give me your flavor impression, 1 to 10. It's fun. and you get to learn what you like, what you don't like. You get to learn what your loved one or your friend or your family member, do they taste things the same as you? Do they like the same things as you? All of our palates are different. We're going to react to things differently. And that's why you look in seed catalogs, be very wary, even of what I talked about at the front about sweet, tart, mild. That's one data point. You have to validate that and see how different you are from that. One of my favorite things to do is to just cut tomatoes into pieces, scoop out the seeds, drizzle them with olive oil, salt, pepper, put them in a slow oven until they don't get totally dried out leathery, but the flavors intensify. And then you can make my favorite summer recipe, which is a roasted tomato crostata. I can forward you the recipe if you just email me. This is goat cheese and lemon peel and pine nuts or almonds and basil and Parmesan cheese. It's so, so good. Last factual topic, myth busting. So in the 1960s, I found when I was researching epic tomatoes, the USDA did a test of hundreds of varieties of tomatoes of every shape, size, and color. And they found that the pH range was about like that. All tomatoes are essentially equally acidic. What varies is the genetic coding for the development of sugars. And if you have a tomato that is loaded with sugars, the acidity will be completely masked. So that's the myth of the low acid yellow, the low acid pink. They're all equally acidic, but they do have highly variable sugar levels. The benefit to us is if you like to be a home canner, if you're growing 100 tomato varieties, any one of those 100 varieties can go into your canning jar. You don't have to worry about acid issues. And we just finished the last of our tomatoes that are 2 years old, and they tasted like the day we canned them. Here's my books, and I am working on a third, but maybe by the end of the year, it will be self-published. But if anybody is interested in signed copies, just drop me an email and we can work that out. I'm here on Zoom talking to you, all of you, spread all over the country, because this man on the left, Walter, my grandfather, and my dad both shared their love of gardening with me at a very, very early age. So my job to you is to grow a gardener. Find a family member, get them excited about this stuff. Here's my contact info. I finally did another blog. Last year I was a blog maniac. I got to get into it again. There's my email. I am starting to do my Instagram lives weekly or so. And how could it be Friday tomorrow? I'm not sure when I'm going to do my next one, but eventually they're weekly. I spend 45 minutes. I do a demo. They're a lot of fun, I hope, for people. They're fun for me. I just hope they're fun for the people that check them out. And there is an online all tomato, self-paced, all video modular course called Growing Epic Tomatoes that Joe Lampel asked me to collaborate with him on. And you can go to his Organic Garden Academy and get a discount by putting in Craig 150. It was a lot of fun to do. It was a lot of work for 2 years. I'm going to end with 2 lists, and I'll flip back and forth. If you were to say, Craig, I'm going to lock you in jail if you don't tell me what your favorite tomatoes are, these are my favorite eating tomatoes for tall varieties. And then these are my favorite eating varieties of our 150 dwarfs. But again, Jeremy, thank you. I hope I didn't blow everybody's mind with too much stuff, but that's the story. That's making epic tomatoes come alive for everybody, and I hope everybody gets something out of that they can use and have a successful garden this year. You're muted.
No, Craig, I think that you did a fantastic job, and I have to thank my employer, Hayes Public Library, for sponsoring this event. You did a great job, and we're really happy to have you here. I think we're going to go through just a few more questions.
Sure.
So if people want to drop that in there, we can do that and talk. We had one that came in. Just 1 second here. Let me get up there. Can you speak to the risk of cross-pollination with closely grown varieties when saving seed?
Oh, yeah. So tomatoes are largely self-pollinated, meaning that maybe 70% of the time, as the flower opens, the anthers brush against the tip of the pistil, the style, and the deed is done. And even if a bee were to visit that flower, it would be fine. Now, what I've found is a lot of the heirloom varieties pop these marigold flowers. They're very attractive to bees. They're big. And somebody asked me the other day, is this related to potato leaf or anything? No, it's related to fruit size. And even those who have grown our dwarfs have seen a lot of them that have big flowers. They can be more attractive to bees. Separating varieties seems kind of silly to me, because whether it's 5 feet or 50 feet or 100 feet, anybody who's been in the yard knows that a bee can cover each of those distances really, really, really fast. So there's 2 ways that I use. One I use regularly, which is I've noticed that the bees do not pay attention to my tomato flowers early in the summer. So if I focus on the lowest cluster and maybe the next one up and save seeds from that, I'm at about 98, 99% sure of getting purity even with plants closely planted. And how I check that out is I'll look at seeds from Lillian's yellow heirloom, which is surrounded by regular leaf varieties, and I'll grow out 100 Lillian's yellow seedlings, and I'll get one that's got regular leaf foliage on it. So very, very low incidence. If you want to guarantee, the only way to do it is to get little breathable bags and look at a flower cluster where the flowers are not open yet, and just loosely gather that up and use a twisty tie and just bag it up. Let the flowers open, let the tomatoes form, and once all of the yellow parts are shriveled and dropped off and you've got the tomatoes you're going to get, mark that cluster with a twisty tie, because then you can be 100% guaranteed that your seeds are going to be just like the parent. So really, that's kind of the way. For my purposes at this point, I'm going with using the first cluster of fruit in a plant method, and it's served me pretty well.
Fantastic. I said, I've been told that you should avoid having to protect tomatoes from a frost, because even if they survive unscathed, they might not produce well the rest of the year. Any thoughts on that?
I am a poster child for taking risk on that. So I have had thousands of tomato seedlings in my Raleigh driveway covered with a double row of Rime, where the temperature has gotten down to 28 degrees. And I lift the Rime in the morning when it's gotten warmer, and the plants all look great. I've had plants on the edge that have gotten a little bit of frostbitten on the foliage, but they thrive. So I have found, Joe Lample and I both we like to use the term the resilience of tomatoes. And they just, it's amazing what they can put up with. So don't feel like if your tomatoes get a little bit of a nip, if they're still alive, they will not be set back at all. Things will kick in and things will be great. And all of the gardens I've had in the last 40 years have pretty much proven that, because I have been a risk taker from day one.
Fantastic. Not a question, but just a couple comments here. Great program. Another person said, loved all the information you gave us. Thank you so much. Someone said, is it possible to rewatch this? I am recording this, so hopefully I will get that sent out to people as long as everything took the way it's supposed to.
Yeah, I mean, I really try to do these better and better every time I do them. So anybody that has any constructive feedback, you can drop it in an email. My job is to share what I've learned and also to learn from all of you. So anything that I've said that you've heard differently about, or you've got a different way to look at something, sharing that with me helps me be better at what I do. So we all kind of learn together. That's what's so great about gardening. It's a bright light in the times we live in.
That's very true. That's very true. Sometimes the first few fruits of the season, wait a second, someone moved. Sometimes the first few fruits of the season don't taste the best. Does that matter when saving seed from those fruits?
No, and so I'm going to give you just 2 minutes of history. Early on in like the 1860s or 70s, seed companies thought that if you save seeds from a cracked tomato, it would give you all cracks, and vice versa. And in fact, you can still see seed catalogs saying, you're going to pay extra for this because it's the first largest melon on the plant. Alexander Livingston came along in 1870 and proved that you can't improve anything by selecting different fruit on the same plant. All the tomatoes on the plant have the same genetic material. So late fruit sometimes don't taste good. Early fruit don't taste good. You could have a tomato with blossom end rot on it. Seeds saved from any of those tomatoes will produce fine fruit in subsequent years. What I have found that temperatures can impact the flavors of tomatoes. So very cool early season or very cool late season, the sun may have a more acute angle onto the plant. The photosynthesis may not be quite as efficient. But no, there's nothing to worry about saving seeds from less flavorful fruit on the plant.
That's good to know.
Mm.
Great program. Thank you so much. Well paced, presented, and moderated. Thank you. Very interesting. Another question. Can you grow the tall tomato plants in containers? Nothing
Oh
indeterminate.
yeah. So if I were growing an indeterminate tomato, if you grow it in 10 gallons or more, it'll pretty much behave like it would if it were in the ground. If you grow it in 5 gallon, you just have to maybe make sure you prune some of the suckers off and feed and water it accordingly, because you're going to have a plant wanting to do big things in a smaller unit. I have actually, for testing purposes, let's say I want to trial 20 varieties, but I don't want to spend a lot of money. It's not yield is not important to me. I've planted them in 2 gallons of soil and I've gotten 10 pounds off the plant, but I've reached the goal, which is I've seen it, I've saved seeds from it, I've tasted it, and the goal was not maximizing the yield anyway. So use your garden like it's your laboratory, play with things. Everybody's got something to discover. And one of the reasons I like to be a rule breaker is I like to discover new things myself. So I'm very bad at reading books, other gardening books, watching YouTubes. I go into the laboratory and I kind of teach myself stuff. The plants teach me. And the soundtrack, the birds, how can you beat that?
Yeah. Well, and kind of go along with those is because you had mentioned earlier, because there are so many people from here in my state of Kansas on the call, whether it's here in Hayes or some other different places that people posted. I also think it's important to always keep in mind of just because something says Midwest grown, Kansas is a great example of a state that is so wildly different from west to east and
Oh
north
yeah,
to south. Elkhart, Kansas, and Southwest Kansas is a whole nother planet to Atchison, Kansas, in the Northeast. It
yeah,
is so wildly different on what we get rainfall wise and
yeah,
water sources and everything else. So kind of
yeah.
be of note to that. I follow someone else, a gardening guy that's kind of the guru on Florida gardening. And
Right.
southern Florida, you can garden all year round, but if you're gardening in the Panhandle, they still get a little bit of a frost.
I
So it's
know,
a,
I
it's a
know.
little different world, even in your own state.
And I think related to that, it's really important for people to know that if you buy, you don't have to limit where you purchase your seeds by a seed company having to be in your state, because almost every company gets their seed sourced from all over, as in all over the world. And there are a few specifically regional seed companies starting to pop up, but don't let that be a detriment. The variety, once you test it, will decide how well it likes growing in your particular climate. But with tomatoes, it's kind of like 3 strikes and you're out. If you're growing a variety that everybody raves about and you get seeds and it's really not very good, there are 3 possibilities. The weather wasn't good for it that year. You don't have what you think you had, or you just don't particularly like that flavor of tomato. So you as the gardener then get to decide, do I go for a different seed source and try it again? Do I email Craig and get the real Cherokee Purple? Because I did a little bit of a study that I wasn't aware that was going on, but I talked with some people from MIT and they gathered about 30 or 40 different seed sources of Cherokee Purple. And they sequenced them. 1/3 of the companies were selling mostly Cherokee Purple. 1/3 of the companies were selling Cherokee Purple. No, they were selling black Krim, but calling it Cherokee Purple. And the other third of the company, who knew what it was, because it was such a complete mix of all kinds of varieties. So be really, really careful of your seed source, but don't condemn the company if they're selling something that's not sourced well. It could be just whoever's supplying them the seed has messed it up somewhere along the line. Again, I do a whole talk about seed companies and we get into screenshots of right tomato, wrong description, right description, wrong tomato, wrong everything. And I don't use seed company names, but there are mistakes out there, man. It's just,
Yeah. Well, I think a perfect example of that is after I grew a Cherokee Purple, I thought it was fantastic. One of the best tomatoes I've ever had. Then everyone said, well, if you liked that, you're going to like Black Krim. It is like, the best of the best. And I grew that. And I still to this day don't know if I grew the right thing because I like bit into it and was like, this is not that great. I mean, like, and I just wondered, I've always kind of wondered like what the condition, if it was the conditions, if it was the source, whatever it was, but it just I was kind of like bummed because I was like, I kind of substituted the thing I did like for this. And but
no.
that's not a condemnation of that variety. People should try it. I have no idea, it just goes to show like if people can rave about
Oh
something, it
yeah.
might not be exactly what you thought.
So my quick Black Krim story, the year that I got Cherokee Purple sent to me, Black Krim was listed in the Seed Savers yearbook from a fellow in Sweden, and I wrote to it. So I was the first person in America that grew Black Krim, and it was not good at all. But I went to my wife and I said, here's Cherokee Purple, here's Black Krim. Yum. Ugh. It was like somebody salted it, and it almost had like a meaty, bland taste to it. People who are loving Black Krim now, I don't think are growing Black Krim anymore. I think it has become crossed with other things. But I've never liked it. I've tried it 3 or 4 times, and it's just, again, personal preference. Black from Tula is a wonderful tomato, and I think people that are growing Black Krim and liking it may be growing Black from Tula because they look almost identical. But I digress. We could do this for hours.
Right. It's like choosing types of wine people like. So
Oh, want to talk about that next? No.
yeah, there you go. I think there was just one more. Well, yeah, I think there was just one more question that came in, and maybe we'll wrap up from there. Can you talk about tomato plants near fences? Any tricks to keep air flowing or flow going?
Yeah, well, so the 2 things I'll say about that is fences are great, but you got to be careful that they'll build up heat, and you are blocking the flow from one way. So you can thin foliage off tomato plants and not harm them. In fact, when people try our dwarf varieties, one of the things they notice is how dense they are. So even though I don't suggest people prune away flowers, I think they should prune away leaves. And I think for people who are growing indeterminate tomatoes against a fence, it may be a good idea to just thin some of those flowers out to increase whatever airflow you can get from it. That's we end up gardening in the space we're kind of stuck with, so to speak, unless you can really engineer things. I would have loved to dug a huge garden to my backyard, but with a septic system, I've fallen in love with the straw bale approach, and it's worked fine. So I would say just thin some foliage and see how it works for you.
Yeah, great. I was gonna say that was gonna be our last question. I remember there was one earlier, and we'll end on this. If you can kind of talk because you talk about it in your second half. Um, can you give a little bit of someone? There was a few different people that asked the history of the mortgage lifter, which I know is a common story that's
Yeah,
told, and I don't know. Sometimes I get mixed, whether that's
yeah.
a real story, is that urban legend, all that stuff.
So there are 2 mortgage lifters. Number 1, the first one is from Barbersville, West Virginia, and was found in Bill Essler's garden. And he suspects it was a bee-produced cross that created this enormous pink tomato. Now he named it mortgage lifter, but that is not the one that the plants were sold for to make money. And he had no idea that a fellow in Logan, West Virginia, named MC Biles, tried to create the biggest tomato he could by using a baby ear syringe to squirt pollen, and using German Johnson and beefsteak and a couple of the varieties. And he did this weird breeding to size up this huge pink tomato. And then word got around and people came to buy plants from all over, and he paid off the $5,000 mortgage to his house. So the Essler mortgage lifter, which is harder to find, is from 1928 and it's from Barbersville. The MC Biles Radiator Charlie mortgage lifter is from the early 1940s from Logan, West Virginia. 2 huge pink tomatoes that people love created almost 20 years apart, neither one of which knew the other was doing it. One just found in a garden, the other one created. And that's your mortgage lifter stories.
Well, that's great. That's great. All right. Well, I think that's a great way to probably wrap up this
Uh,
fantastic talk. I think everyone really enjoyed it, and we thank you again, Craig, for being with us kind of late here at night.
oh, no problem. And thanks to all my friends who join and all my friends I don't know are friends yet. We are
Yeah,
now. And hope you all keep in touch. Have a great garden.
great. All right. Thank you, Craig, and good
Bye,
night,
Jeremy.
everybody.
Good night.